Ladies and gentlemen, indeed, let me begin formally. Thank you for your patience, and indeed to the tens of thousands of people who are joining us through live streaming. Thank you to them also for their patience as we begin 15 minutes late. The fact that there are more than 450 people present this evening, this event is being recorded and live streamed, is an indication of the significance of the presentations you're going to hear this evening. I am Andrew Cuby. I have the good fortune to be the convener of the outreach programme of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and particularly involved in our RSE at Inverness initiative, which I will talk of in a moment. The Royal Society of Edinburgh was formed about 40 years after the events of 1747, which bring us all here this evening. It is the National Academy of Scotland. It is made up of 1,700 distinguished fellows. They're distinguished, I'm just here. And we are interesting in the sense that the group is interdisciplinary to the extent that we have representatives who come from the arts, humanities, science, business, law, education. Many of our sister academies around the world, other national academies, including the Royal Society in London, are entirely scientifically based. We believe this gives us a strength when, in particular, we look at issues of public policy. To a fair degree, the RSE is an enormous think tank. We are asked to contribute to debates about public policy for Scotland, public policy for the UK, and indeed, for instance, at the moment, we have inquiries going on into aspects of Brexit. So the range of what we engage in is considerable. I have to say to you, however, that until probably 5 or 10 years ago, our focus was very much on the Central Belt. And a number of us felt that if we could lay claim to the title properly of being the National Academy for Scotland, we should have outreach activity in a more dynamic way than we'd had. Now, of course, in the digital age, outreach becomes much simpler. But in reality, unless you get out and talk to people around the country, then you don't get a proper sense of the issues that are important to them. So this is, in fact, the 5th outreach programme we have run, and those programmes have enabled us to collaborate with local organisations to augment what they do, and indeed to make sure that issues that we have developed in our main programme of work within Edinburgh particularly, are capable of being taken more widely across Scotland. That gives us considerable flexibility, and indeed a number of you I know, because I see faces I recognise, joined us last September when we launched the RSE at initiative in Inverness, and indeed that programme will run for at least a couple of years. And as we come to the end of this evening, I will describe some of the other issues that absorb us. However, one of the flexibilities of what we do is that if you don't allow for passion, then it is possibly the case you won't proceed as well as you might. One of my colleagues on the steering group that I chair is Sue Black, who is the reason that so many of you are here this evening. And Sue made pretty clear when we determined that the next outreach programme would be in Inverness, she made very, very abundantly evident that if we did not address the issues around Lord Lovat, she was probably going to be off or worse. So the fact we're all here tonight is entirely down to Sue. And thank you for that, Sue. Now, before I introduce our speakers and tell you how the evening will develop, let me give you some inevitable housekeeping instructions. The emergency exits in this room are marked No fire alarm is expected, and if indeed an alarm does sound, then please follow the instructions given to you by staff colleagues. Please do switch off your mobile phones. I say that to you to save embarrassment to you and annoyance to us. Actually, I quite enjoy it when someone's mobile phone goes off at an event like this, because the embarrassment level is high and the apology is always, oh, it was my grandson who put that tone on it. We won't believe you. But if you could switch them off. I've already referred to the fact that there is live streaming of this event, so please don't take photographs as the event goes on, because it is not only being live streamed, the whole event is being recorded as well, and in due course on our website, an abstract of tonight's proceedings will appear. And I say that in regard to the fact that you are therefore on television, potentially, and some of you may have been as amused as I was, saddened by the family circumstances, when earlier this week I read of the fact that a bigamist had been rooted out by the fact he had been seen on television with his wife and identified as such, which came as a bit of a shock to his first wife, to whom he was still married. So if anybody wants to leave now, then we will not be judgmental. Now, what we would like to do tonight is firstly to set some context to the work that Sue and her colleagues will describe. So we will initially hear about the mausoleum at Kirkhill. We'll have a video contribution from Dan Snow, and then we will hear about the historic setting in which the events that will be described to us took place. So it's therefore my considerable pleasure to invite representatives of the mausoleum at Kirkhill to come and talk to us in regard to the mausoleum and the work they do. And I therefore invite Simon Fraser and Eric to talk to us. I think, Simon, you're going to speak to us first of all.
Thank you very much, Sir Andrew. Firstly, tonight I think we have to thank the RSE, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, for holding this meeting. It's tantamount to the amount of people that are here and the interest that is in it. And it's good that we're running this meeting tonight and to see such a huge audience which thrusts our mausoleum into the spotlight with both press and television coverage. I take the building part of the evening.
Excuse me, we're not hearing you.
Oh, sorry. We all know the reason for such interest is not in the building itself, but in the remains of the crypt, which we hope to be proven to be that of the 11th Lord Lovat, known to everybody as Simon the Fox. When the Mausoleum Trust was set up in the 1990s, the old fox was not the reason this restoration was considered. The building itself had fallen into a serious state of disrepair. At that time, it was home to a number of just feral pigeons who entered in and out of the bars on the window at will. As a teenager, I was shown into the crypt by the late Wing Commander Alistair Fraser of Wardlow, and I must have been a teenager at the time. And my recollection of that experience was that the crypt was full of coffins in those days. Now there only remains 5. The Mausoleum Trust, which I am part of, was set up in the early 1990s to see if funds could be accessed to restore the building to its original state. We had a diverse range of directors. We had a sculptor, an accountant, an architect, a lawyer, 3 farmers. The farming directors were, some of, if you're here from the Field Club tonight, might remember Donald Coggle, Charles Gare, and I was the other, and I'm still here. Fred Geddes was our architect and clerk of works, and Ewan Fraser, son of the late Wing Commander Fraser, and Douglas Graham as our legal advisor. Virginia Fraser was also involved in it, as was, where I missed out, Leonie Gibbs, sorry Leonie, as a director. Some local fundraising took place to demonstrate that we were serious with our intentions, but what we really wanted was a donation from the Heritage Lottery Fund. When this was granted after a lot of work, Historic Scotland then granted us most of the rest of the cost. Tenders were prepared, and the chosen contractor was Holland Taws, who carried out the work to strict Historic Scotland specifications. The building was opened in 1998 and was considered to be as sound as when first built. A big plus for us to the hope that it is indeed Simon the Fox is that he had instigated improvements to the mausoleum in 1722 with the addition of the tower. And this would have been his own wish to be buried in the crypt. To the Fraser clansmen, it would have been no problem to have smuggled his body north to Kirkhill, as in that time as it is today. There was no shortage of funeral directors called Fraser in Inverness. Thank you.
I would now ask Eric Lundberg to speak to us as well. Eric has, I think, the wonderful title of being the custodian of the mausoleum. So, Eric.
Thank you, Andrew, and Simon. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. It's amazing to see such a level of interest in someone who died 270 years ago and may or may not be buried in a mausoleum in a small village 8 miles west of Inverness. I've been involved with the mausoleum for about 20 years now, after having bought the house at the gate to the graveyard. I was asked to look after the key to let visitors look around, and was asked questions I didn't know the answer to. As a result, I had to find out about its history and that of the Frasers of Lovat who built it. This has snowballed into a bit of an obsession, and I now do talks in and about the mausoleum, look after the maintenance and repairs, and I'm working with our 2 trustees, Simon Fraser and Fred Geddes, to put it on a sound footing for the future. When we started, we had a few guests recorded each year, but last year we had about 2,000, and we now have over 29 tour companies and guides that bring their guests, in addition to tourists that see the brown mausoleum sign in Inchmore and come to take a look. Many of our visitors come as part of an Outlander tour, and we're very grateful to Diana Gabaldon and her wonderful books for their impact on Scottish and especially Highland tourism. I've made many friends amongst Outlander fans, especially the Inverness Outlander group here present tonight. One of the reasons I'm pleased to show guests around is the opportunity it gives them to make a small donation for the upkeep of the building. These are all very gratefully received and can also be made through our Mandonate page on our website, wardlawmausoleum.com. However, a storey building like this needs a lot of care and maintenance, and we now need to raise a further £100,000 for a programme of repairs. It would take many years to raise this through the donations box, so my daughter Freya, in front of me here, suggested we raise our profile through social media. She runs our Twitter, Facebook and Instagram accounts, all beyond an old fogey like me. This has allowed people from all over the world to interact with us, and Anna Gabaldon herself asked the big question, can we prove it's him? And that's why we're here tonight. The official line is he's buried in the chapel of the Tower of London, but the family and the locals have always thought he's buried at Wardlaw, the building he himself remodelled in 1722, as Simon told us. There have been several investigations into this question over the years since his execution, but no definite answer. However, now we have access to new forensic techniques, including DNA analysis, and who is the best-known expert in the field? Sue Black, of course. She was raised in Inverness and works in Dundee, just down the A9. Perfect. We contacted Sue and she was delighted to help. suggesting the investigation could be part of the RSE at Inverness programme. We are very grateful for the support and the work of Kate Kennedy and our team in organising this evening's event, and the Kings Mills Hotels for hosting it for us. The idea was approved by our trustees and by Simon Lord Lovett, the current chief of the Frasers of Lovett. He's appointed Sarah Fraser to speak on behalf of the family, and we are grateful for her help with the project too. Sue and her colleague Lucina Hackman came to see us in October 2016 to have a peek in the coffin, just in case it was empty. It wasn't. We also had a biology lesson from Sue at my dining table and learned that establishing his identity would not be a simple process of just examining DNA, if we could obtain any. We then planned how to carry out an investigation with Sue's usual scientific rigour, just like the many other remains she's examined. In order to bring Sue's work to the widest possible audience, we looked for a TV partner, and were delighted when Dan Snow agreed to film our work. His involvement has really raised our profile, and Nathan's technical genius here is enabling our event to be live streamed around the world on Dan's History Hit channel. Hello out there. I can't wait to find out what Sue has to tell us tonight. Are we any closer to answering the question, where is Simon the Fox buried? We'll see.
Simon and Eric, thank you very much indeed for very personally talking to us about your interest in Lord Lovett. You've already alluded to the fact that you don't need to be called Fraser to be interested in indeed what happened, and it's clear to me that Dan Snow has become completely fixated by the events, as will be evident in the clips we're going to see from him in a moment. He is very distressed not to be with us this evening, but as Eric has indicated, he is creating programme material which is going to continue on his new channel, which I understand gets about 1 million hits a month. So what brings us here this evening is intriguing to other people as well. So we'll now see what he has to say.
Hi everyone, I'm Dan Snow, and I've been lucky enough to be following Sue Black's team from the University of Dundee as they try and unravel the mystery of Simon Fraser's coffin. It has been a fantastic experience. We made a documentary for my new history channel, historyhit.tv, go and check it out. And I'm particularly interested in Simon Fraser because he is the last great Highland laird, this extraordinary strand in our history that went on for centuries. He's Britain's last great traitor, the last man to be beheaded by the British state for treason. And also, he played such a seminal part in Britain's last civil war, the Jacobite uprising of 1745 to 46. All in all, it's the perfect story, and that's before you even come to the mystery surrounding his final resting place. So tonight you're going to be hearing from Professor Sue Black about her investigations into that corpse we found in the crypt at Wardlaw. I can say it was one of the most exciting days of my life, and it was also such a privilege to see Sue Black, a national treasure, at work. It gained press attention here in the UK and abroad as well, and tonight really is the climax of that. I'm very sorry not to be there, but here are some clips from the show that I made to give you a sense of what's gone before. In 1747, Simon Fraser, Lord Lovett, was executed in London for treason, rebelling against his king. But it was the start of a mystery. This man, who was the last to be beheaded by the British state for treason, was buried, apparently, in London. But his family have always maintained that he was brought back up to his native Highlands and buried in the family mausoleum here in Wardlaw. Today, we're going to open his coffin and find out the truth. In the late 1660s, a baby was born in a house now demolished on the banks of this burn in the Highlands of Scotland. That child would grow into Simon Fraser, the 11th Lord Lovett, a man whose life and career typified the wild life up here in the Highlands in the 18th century. A world of political jockeying, violence, blood feuds and tested loyalties. He was, in many ways, the last Highlander. On the 9th of April 1747, Lord Lovat was brought from the Tower out to Tower Hill, where traditionally traitors had been executed. It was a huge event. Hastily erected stands were made to accommodate all the spectators, one of which collapsed, leading to the death of something like 9 people. Lord Lovat had a wry smile when he saw that. He was brought here. Among his last words was the quote from the Latin poet, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and proper to die for your country. In his mind, he was dying as a Scottish patriot. He was brought here and executed by beheading. The last man to be beheaded for treason in Britain. But this is not where the story ends, because traditionally these rebels were taken into the Tower of London and buried in a shallow grave. But Lord Lovat's clansmen, his family, have always insisted that he had a different fate. The family have long believed that his body was in fact taken back to Scotland and laid to rest in the family vault at Wardlaw. The investigation is being led by one of the world's most respected forensic anthropologists, Professor Sue Black and her team from Dundee University. We're suited up to protect us from the lead dust and to protect the remains from contamination. In charge of removing the remains from the coffin is Dr. Lucina Hackman. It's time to open the coffin.
Do you mind taking the big end?
Okay, yeah.
I think that's probably safest. So 1, 2, 3. Oh, it's going to be heavy because it's lead. So, what we've got is what we'd expect. A wooden coffin within the lead outer coffin. And you can see we've got the lid, or what was the lid, but that's deteriorated quite a lot, so we'll need to lift that off.
Wow.
And
Okay.
take that
So this
away.
wood's 250 years old, is it?
Would have been what was put in
Wow, this is the
originally,
original
yes.
coffin. Okay, here we go.
So, you can see the original. So if I just hand that to you,
Yeah.
we'll just very carefully lift it off.
Okay, great. Wow.
And
What are we seeing?
that'll expose the inner areas. So what we're seeing here, you can still see the edges of the wooden coffin. Here, you can see the top and you can see the bottom. This has collapsed a bit. And what we are seeing some bones. So we're seeing some bones here. You can see a few here. You can see some bones. They're vertebrae, some distal femur, yes. So I think probably what we need to do is very systematically start taking the contents from this end and gradually take them out and then examine them carefully upstairs. So that's the next step.
Is this, you've seen so many bodies and burials, is this typical? Does this look like it's been interfered? Like, are you able to make any other judgments about its condition at the moment?
The condition isn't great, from what I can see at the moment. Because of time, bone decomposes, as does any part of the body. Teeth tend to decompose the slowest.
Okay.
Soft tissue goes quicker, and bone decomposes slowly. If you've got the right environment, it can become stable and last for a very long time. But in the wrong environment, it will decompose. And what you have here is a situation where the coffin design will have kept the damp in. So whatever damp was there as the body decomposed will stay. And damp isn't very good for bone at all.
So it's good that some of it seems to survive.
Yes.
It doesn't look much like a body to me, but Lucina is starting to identify some remains.
Trying to work out what we've got. So I think we've got here, these are the femora, so these are the thigh bones. This is a line of the thigh bone coming down here. You see this line here, that's the shaft of the femur.
Yeah.
This, for example, that's actually preserved really nicely. So I think we're going to get some preservation. This is a bone of the heel. of the foot. So it's a calcaneus. So this is another foot bone here. It's the talus, which sits on top of the calcaneus. So the bones of the heel here. So they're quite nicely preserved, but they're very stocky. If you think about the fact that that takes all your body weight on a regular basis as you're walking, they're really robust bones anyway in life. So they tend to last better.
Anything Lucina finds is taken up for Sue to examine in detail.
So you can see that there's very dark colour. So what's happened with the bones is as the body decomposes, the fluid's slightly acidic.
Okay.
And so the fluid mixes with the wood on the inside of the coffin, and you form something called humic acid.
Oh.
And it effectively would have looked a bit like chocolate mousse. And so the bones take up the colour of that dark wood around it.
It's quite hard down there to tell which is bone.
What's bone and what's wood, because it takes on the colour of it. So that's what it's done. So this is bone. It's very light and it's very fragile because it's been quite wet in the bone, in the coffin. And this is the right heel bone. So this is the heel at the back.
Yeah.
This is the bit that's going forward onto the foot. So that's the calcaneus. This is the talus. And so that's the bone that sits on there like that.
I think from what I can see, it's clearly the body of a beheaded 70-something-year-old man.
Did you do that from 2 bones of the foot? You're good.
Well,
You're
you know.
good.
Maybe I'm better off leaving it to the profession. Before long, some better preserved bones start to appear. Well, I hope you get a sense there of just how exciting it was to be involved. Thank you to Professor Sue Black and her team at the University of Dundee for letting me follow and play a small part. I learned a huge amount, particularly from Sue Black. What an absolute national treasure, what a legend. Also, the team at Wardlaw, they are wonderful custodians of an important heritage site. Thank you also to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for hosting this remarkable event, and I hope you all enjoy as you hear the climax of the story of Simon Fraser.
Thank you, Dan. If you're listening or watching somewhere, or in due course, you hear and see this, because your support in all of this has been tremendous in enabling us to reach a wider audience. And certainly, Sue, I will never regard you in quite the same way again, other than now one of our national treasures.
Treasures are things you bury.
No, you visit and you admire them and listen to them. Someone else we are privileged to be able to listen to tonight is Sarah Fraser. Sarah is a distinguished author and broadcaster, and I think in her determination to select a period of history, the British Stuart era, she could have hardly chosen a more rich and tumultuous period to bring to life for us, because one of the benefits of Sarah's writing is that she is able not only to describe the events of the time, but to give a vivid insight into them as if we ourselves had been there. And of course, many of these descriptions are of individuals who were magnificent individuals. They would have been magnificent in any generation, but many of them lived doomed lives. And it's interesting that some of her phraseology, Dan has already referred to, in terms of the fabulous book she produced, The Last Highlander, Scotland's Most Notorious Clan Chief, Rebel and Double Agent. It is because of the nature of that writing that became, shortly after publication, one of the best e-selling books on the New York Times list. So we are really delighted you're with us, Sarah.
Thank you, Andrew, and the RSE, and the National Treasure, and her lovely National Treasurette. That's just great. And thank you all for coming out tonight and surviving the weather that we've been having. We've had weather, as they say. I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to go back to what it was like to be with Sue and Lucina on that day, and Dan and Nathan, of course, and just to say what it felt like to go through this kind of exhumation. It's a very particular experience. And then, of course, I won't do that for long. I will then go back to that last year of Lovett at the 45's life and what we know happened to him and what we think happened to him. And right at the end, I'm going to pose a question about who gives a damn? You know, does this change anything for history? Does it matter? Before I hand over to Sue and Lucina. St. Augustine said, we're going back even further now, he said, the dead are not absent, they are only invisible. And when you're walking up to that mausoleum and entering it, of course, a mausoleum, to state the obvious, is a place where we gather our dead. And there is an atmosphere anyway about these places. But when you see two people inside who are quietly and attentively gathering and sifting information and trying to bring somebody back to the surface, you are aware that the dead are not absent, they are only invisible. And when Sue said, and I was sort of puzzled as to why particularly this atmosphere hung around the place, and Sue said that these were human, and what was human is human still, and must be treated as if it was still human. And I thought that that spirit of respect for the dead who were all round us, they were under our feet, they're in the walls, they're everywhere, that presided over this activity and gave it a very particular feeling. And I valued that because as a biographer, one of the things I do is, as Andrew kindly said, I try and bring the dead back to life. And that's a slightly perilous thing to do because you're getting in amongst them in the way that Sue and Lucina were getting in amongst those remains. And you must be respectful. You are opening coffins. And they have opened the coffin on those remains. And what it did for me was open the coffin on Lovett's world and Lovett's life, and it brought it all back to me. And I'm going to speak a little bit now about that last year of Lovett's life and what happened after his death. He was captured in June after the Battle of Culloden, June 1746. And he had been somebody who, as probably most people know here, had been a duplicitous dog. You know, he had more than usually suffered from conflicting impulses. He was, on the one hand, an urbane and lace-wristed courtier of kings, but he also was a Jacobite conspirator, a government placeman, a rebel, a double agent. He'd found it difficult to hold it all together. But by the 1740s, he was set, funnily enough, for a quiet end, until the siren song of the Stuarts came and Bonnie Prince Charlie landed. When he was captured by Cumberland said, "I imagine that the taking of Lord Lovat is a greater humiliation than anything that can have happened to the Highlands, because he is dignified with great titles and ranks high in command." Now, in some ways, that's slightly over-egging the omelette, but I think he's doing it for a reason. Let's be honest. The key target is Charles Edward Stuart, probably also Lord George Murray. These people have got away. Lovat has been important in the Highlands, but he is about now to become an icon of treachery and evil. And the key word there is imagine. He's making this image of Lovat. And Lovat becomes what they call these days a high-value target. And they've got him. And they're delighted. And they build him up into this enormous figure. And they need to do that because after 30 years of peace, the whole nation is electrified by the Bonnie Prince's lunge for the throne of his ancestors, and terrified. They got so far so fast. And where is he? Where are they? What are they planning next? So we've got someone who matters, and this person is going to help us to kill this thing. They take him south, and the myth-making continues. He is greeted by Hogarth, who makes who makes the portrait that's in the National Portrait Gallery, although there are loads of copies of it, and also this cartoon from it. That sold out 12 times in the 10 months that he was in the Tower. It was really important that they had him. He was talked up in the news sheets as notoriously to be suspected, wicked, evil, the great Leviathan, England's old foe, the man whose jaw they'd put a hook into and they were going to reel him in. And they did, of course. That's what they did. He was tried, well, he wasn't, he was impeached by all his fellow peers, hundreds of them, and executed. And even Walpole, who wrote to a friend later that night, probably a few days later, he said, "I think this will strike terror into the Highlanders, that there is any power so great as the British state, hurrah, hurrah, that can bring so potent a tyrant to the block. He has become a symbol of the traitor, and the symbol is now dead." And that's Thursday, the 7th of April, 1747. And on the 17th of April, it's recorded Lord Lovat was buried. Game over, basically, isn't it? Except, of course, it isn't. I mean, why would you wait? If you're quickly going to put him into a shallow grave, why wait 10 days? Why keep the body for 10 days? What are you going to do with it? Suddenly think, OK, boys, let's bury him today. Well, no, that's not what they're going to do. Because, of course, they don't have the body. We know they don't have the body, so there isn't a body to bury. And our evidence for that is in some letters. And I'm going to talk about those a wee bit. The gist of those is that William Fraser, writer to the Signet, lawyer, and a Lovat's law agent in Edinburgh, he called him Little Willie Fraser, very fond of him. He was with Lovat for a lot of that last year of his life and on the scaffold. He and another man, James Fraser, who was an apothecary at Craven Street off the Strand. He was also, coincidentally, the grandson of Master James Fraser, who wrote the Wardlaw Chronicles, which are the chronicles of the Frasers. Fabulous things. I mean, they trace us back to Adam and Eve and beyond. Right back to the Big Bang, really. You know, we were there. We did it. These two seem to have got the permission of someone in the House of Lords to take the body, and I think they were supposed to take it quickly, quietly, down to, they get an undertaker, they got a Mr. Stevenson, down to the Thames, I mean it's on the Thames, the Tower, and take it home. And this seems to have been quite well known, because a man called Hugh Ingalls, an Indonesian, wrote to a friend, and he's a merchant, and he's talking about commodities and credit and selling stuff and buying boats. And then he casually says, "Oh, they're bringing Lovat home, by the way, in the Pledger." And that seems to be something that everyone was quite familiar with. So far, so good. But what happened was that on the 13th of April, so he's been out a week now, just about, the Lieutenant Governor of the Tower, Williamson, who's supervised Lovat for the last year of his life, he is, and likes him, you know, as far as you can like someone who's, you know, wants to destroy your country. And he has written to Newcastle, the Secretary of State, and he says, I'm slightly anxious. He said, "There are men come who have conveyed the body of Lord Lovat from the Tower. They did it on the day. We waited a few hours to let the crowds disperse," because he's fully aware they do not want to be making Jacobite martyrs here. And it's the detail I like. The fact that he says we waited a few hours to let the crowds disperse. That, to me, is the sort of detail you simply wouldn't make up if you're lying. And he assumes Lovat's gone north. And then he says, "But, to my great surprise, I find they have been making a show of him for money." So they've got the body, Mr. Stevenson's come with the coffin. They've got it out somewhere, probably Stevenson's undertakers, and they're displaying it. This is not part of the narrative. The narrative that's been built up around with Cumberland, ever since Cumberland, Hogarth, the news sheets, Walpole, everybody, he's supposed to go now. This is not, I mean, how can you have an escaped prisoner who's dead? You know, I mean, you've had a prisoner all year, you've cut his head off, and now he's escaped. That's hard to explain to the king, especially when he doesn't speak very good English. So what happens? Newcastle writes back on the 16th. It takes him another 3 days to write back. And he says, you are to secure said body, and how, and bring it back, he says. And then, quotes, he says, you are to take care then to inter it within the Tower in a private manner. We don't want anyone shaking their fist and cursing Lord Lovat, and we certainly don't want people patting him saying, don't worry, Simon, we'll be back. He is not to be an ember around which this conflagration can blow up again. That is not to happen. And then the coffin comes back, there's a body in it, and it's buried. That's what happens, and that explains that gap. But it cannot be that difficult to get a body, as Eric was saying, in London in the mid-1700s. I mean, they just don't, they're not that regulated about recording deaths and death certificates and things. And I mean, it's really probably purely hygiene that you'd worry about where bodies were. And he then, there is further evidence. There's evidence that he is there, because in the 1800s, you know, the problem with putting bodies, especially in shallow graves, I mean, by definition, they're quite near the surface and they collapse the way Lovat did. So in the 1800s, they probably had a bit of subsidence and they were clearing stuff up, and they opened up a slab in the bottom of the tower, and the three Jacobite lords, Lovat, Balmerino and Kilmarnock, were there, but they'd sort of collapsed and they'd all been mushed together. So they were put together in one coffin and walled up behind the wall. But, of course, family legend has it that he actually came home and it wasn't the right body. A coffin went back, but there is another coffin here. It is the right sort of status. It is the coffin plate. I know, because I spent time reading Simon's letters. He had to do with the writing of that coffin plate. It's his phraseology and his concerns. And how typical of Lovat. How typical of him to sort of just elude being nailed down at the end. The man has two graves. I mean, he lived so many lives on so many levels. And Lucina and Sue are going to explain what it is that they've found. And what I want to leave you with is a question, because there is another question behind this. It's all right for all of us in Inverness and all of you, wherever you are in the world. But Justin Webb, one of the presenters on the Today programme, he asked Dan, when Dan was coming up to film here, in that very Today programme way, he said, yeah, but, you know, whether it is or it is not him, Dan, you know, does this matter for history? Does it change anything? And I was eating my Crispies and I thought, well, hell yeah, you know, I would say that, but I admit I'm prejudiced here. But to me it does, because what all these things do is they bring things back to the surface and they throw lights on bits of history that otherwise we forget, or the record thins out and we know one thing but not another. And, for example, what happened here, it was not good after Culloden, and it went quickly from pacification to retribution. And much as we now the British Empire overseas, we now are quite happy to acknowledge things happened in Africa and Australia and India and so on. That first empire, the Empire of Great Britain, was still pretty new and didn't quite work, if it works now. It certainly wasn't working perfectly then. And Cumberland quite soon lost his patience with the Highlanders. He was irritable. Why wasn't he back in Germany fighting wars, protecting his patrimony there? And he looked around one day, and I quote, he said, "I tremble that this stinking spot, thank you very much, will yet become the ruin of my family and our island." And he sent orders out that you are to hunt and pursue these vermin through their lurking holes. He's talking about his fellow Britons, apparently. And there is something about civil unrest, the domestic violence that we do to each other, that arouses these peculiarly strong passions. But this is us as human beings doing this to each other, us as Britons. And what about the prisoners? These are the people that escaped. The prisoners they brought into Inverness, put into every lockable space. And when they ran out, of course, there were prison hulks, the Jean and the Liberty and Property. And they were dragged into the Firth. And 157 men went down into one. And when they were looking for people to testify against Lovat during his impeachment, they thought they would try and find some prisoners there. So they rowed out and they opened the hatch. And the officer said, who's a government officer, he said, "What a scene assailed my nose and eyes all at once." He said, "The wounded were standing there, festering in their gore and blood. The dead were quite covered over with piss and dirt, and the living standing up to their middle in it. And only 47 came out." And so I'm now going to finish by saying that the dead are not absent, they are only invisible. None of them are absent. Not Lovat of the 45, not the people who died in the hills or in the holes, not the men who died in those prison hulks. They are not, they are only invisible. And what Sue and Lucina are going to do for you now is try and make them visible, these people who were there. And for that, I think, this matters. It is a bigger history than merely those remains. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much. You have powerfully evoked the past for us in the way I described earlier on. It is no surprise that wounds of the antiquity back to 1747 can still bleed quite easily in the way that you describe them. Thank you. We come now to a part of the evening which is going to be, I think, particularly memorable, because we're going to hear both from Sue Black and Lucina Hackman. Much has been said of each of them already, and there's nothing worse than having someone chair an event like this and say, well, Sue Black needs no introduction, and then I rabbit on for 15 minutes to imply that that statement was not right. So I will give you only one or two vignettes about Sue beyond what is now going to be the description that's going to remain with you forever. It will be on...
Where to find his body.
Whatever the outcome, it will be in your obituary. Sue has led work in Dundee University as a forensic anthropologist and a human anatomist in a most distinguished way. I think the particular skill you have, which we've seen actually in the way that Sarah presented to us, is to make concepts and ideas comprehensible to the rest of us who are not as skilled in the discipline. And it's no surprise, therefore, that she has received awards from Brian Cox and Stephen Fry in regard to the way in which she describes science. And if you did not hear her on Desert Island Discs, go and dig that out, because that was wonderful. I'm not going to refer to the numerous honorary fellowships and other distinctions she has, but these, I think, indicate the nature of the wider proposition that Sue brings. And in Lucina, we have someone working with her very closely and in a way which has her career already recognised significantly by the work she undertakes with senior police officers and forces around the UK and internationally. And indeed, given that one of her interests is in regard to mass fatality planning, I'm left with the view of both of them that actually delving into issues in the 18th century is a means of escaping the horrors of the 21st. And I do hope you found it has been therapy. Lucinda.
Thank you. That was very kind. And thank you for having me here this evening. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. I'm just going to talk this evening about I'm going to start to set the scene. So I'm not a historian, I'm a forensic anthropologist, and I'm going to talk about what it is that we did when we attended Wardlaw Mausoleum. We were asked to go along. Well, I was asked by Sue to assist. I found out why a little bit later, and I'll share that with you. I was asked to go with Sue to assist to try and solve a mystery, and I can never resist trying to solve a mystery. So I said yes. And we headed out to answer the question of whether or not Simon Lovett, the old fox, was actually in the crypt at Wardlaw Mausoleum. What I need to do is go through with you what we had to do to try and start answering that question. Not being a historian, I had to go and have a look, because what we need to do as anthropologists is we need to understand a little bit about the person themselves to be able to start to answer the question of whether or not we've found that individual. So what we have to do is to start looking at questions about that person that we can start to answer when we look at their bones, because your bones will tell us something about you and about how you've lived your life. So we're going to start to look at some of the things that will start to narrow down the answers, start to answer the question for us. We need to know the sex of the individual. Were they male? Were they female? How old were they when they died? So that's another thing that's going to start to narrow down our focus. We're going to be able to start matching the information we get from the bones that we see to the information we know about that person. It's much easier when we actually have that information. Sometimes we do this for people, remains and skeletal remains, and we have no idea who that person is. We're trying to provide those answers. In this case, we need to have a look and see what we know about Lord Lovett to start to try and match those two pieces of information. Once we know some things about them, biological information, sex, age at death, we also start to need to know some things about that person that are personal to them, that will maybe narrow it down. There were a lot of people, a lot of males who died around that time. Okay, we need to start to think about things that will actually separate out the information we have from all of the other males. Is this the individual we're looking for? So we start to looking for individuating features, things that can tell us about him and how he lived his life, that we can use to separate him out from all of the other males. So we know some information. We went to have a look. We had to look at the records, the written records about Lord Lovett. We looked at photos and images. Not photos, I apologise. It wasn't in those days, was it? Okay. Just so you know, it's quite terrifying standing at the front here, all right? So bear with me. I'll get there. So we looked at images. that we have from the historical records, written records as well, and what sort of information we can start to bring together to start to look at this matching process to see if we can start to answer the question that we've been asked of whether or not this was Lord Lovat in this mausoleum. So, when we look at his sex, we know that he was male from the records. I don't think there's any question about that. Everyone's quite happy with that. We do have a little bit of a question about his age at death. Okay, and we had a long journey up here from Stonehaven to try and decide. We don't agree on his age at death, Sir and I, but because I think at the time there are very few records at the time of people of when they were born. So we know when he died. I don't think there's any query about that, but his date of birth, there may be some queries around that. So he was in his late 70s to about 80 years of age. Okay, so he's an elderly individual if you're looking at it in relation to the skeletal changes that we're looking for. What other information? What sort of the personal information? We don't know how tall he was, but what other information can we get? So we know from the records that he's recorded as not being able to walk because he was suffering from gout and arthritis as well. And those two will leave markers on the bone. So we've got gout and arthritis, so that will start to separate that out. Now, gout was something that was more common in the past, but it was not across the whole, seen across the whole population. Okay, so it's a reduced number of people. Arthritis, as it is today, is much more common. And we know that he was beheaded from the records. Now, that's going to be quite useful when we start to try and sort him out from other individuals that might be in the crypt. So if we start to look at what sort of information that's going to give us from the skeleton, if we find skeletal remains, and you know by now that we did, okay, that's not a secret, we're going to start looking at this information, but what are we going to find and how are we going to work that out? So if we look at the, and I do need to give a little bit of a warning, there are some images of bones, but they are images of bones. Okay? All forensic anthropologists like their images of bones, so that's not going to be a surprise. We're going to look for the pelvis. Now there are differences between male and female skulls, but we have information here that this individual would have been beheaded. We look at the difference between the male and female pelvis. The female pelvis multitasks, the male pelvis does not. The female pelvis is about giving birth as well as being able to walk around. Okay, so the male pelvis is going to be a slightly different shape to the female pelvis because of that. So we're going to be able to look at the shape of these bones to try and differentiate out males from females. What other areas are we going to look at? If we're looking at the skeletal remains, we're looking for different areas to tell us the age at death. So we're going to look at what we call the sternal ends of the ribs, so the ends of the ribs that come round towards the front of the body here, and also the area in the pelvis at the front, pubic symphysis, where the two bones at the front come together. Both of those show age-related changes. So as we age, they change. And we can look at those changes and we can start to say how old that person was when they died. So this is the other information we're going to start trying to look at and finding. So those are images of the ends of the ribs and the changes that you can see at the ends of the ribs. We know he had gout. We know he suffered from it. Now, gout can affect hands and feet. So they're not just limited to the feet, but I had a lot of circles on this image. So we're going to look at the foot bones and we're going to look at the hand bones to see if we can see the changes that happen with gout. So with gout you get crystals forming in joints, and that will actually change what happens to the joints. You'll actually see where the crystals have damaged the bone as they've formed. Now, he was described as not being able to walk as a result of the gout, which would indicate that the gout was, it's painful, it's a really painful condition, and was probably long-standing as well. So we would expect to see these bone changes on his feet and his hands, potentially, although certainly I would expect to see his feet affected by the fact that this meant that he found walking difficult. So I would expect to see that his feet were affected. Arthritic changes. I would look for all of the arthritic changes in the joints. There are changes that happen as a result of arthritis, including bone polishing. The bones get very polished. You get a lot of bone growth around the joints. So we're going to look for those within those joint spaces and of all of the joints of the bone. So we're going to start bringing all of this information together so we can start to say, is this a male individual? When we're looking at the remains that we find, is this a male individual? How old were they when they died? And were they suffering from these conditions? Finally, beheading will leave marks on the bones. So the beheading will leave marks on whilst the skull. I'm not expecting to find the skull in this situation, but I am expecting to see the neck, the vertebrae of the neck, the bones of the neck, and expect to see marks of where the blade actually chopped through that bone. You were going to damage that bone, and we will recognise those when we see them. So we're going to be looking for all of these clues when we start to have a look at the bones. So just to set the scene, okay, you've seen the images of the mausoleum now. We are looking at the crypt, which is just underneath the mausoleum. You can see there, that's the entryway. And for those of you that have seen the videos, you've seen me getting in and out of that. This is the point at which I realised why I'd been invited, because I got sent down into the crypt. It's quite difficult. You can stand up in the middle of it, but it's actually curved and comes down either side. And that's a cross-section of the location of the coffins. We had a plan. We needed to know there's a number of coffins in the room. So we need to work out which coffin we need to open. So the coffins, there were a small one and then 4 larger coffins. They did have nameplates on. Lord Lovett's, the one that was said to be Lord Lovett's coffin, had got a nameplate on it, but that had been removed, but that had been recorded, so we knew which one that was. The others had nameplates on, and we have a plan of where the coffins are lying. So we know which coffin we need to look at and which we are interested in. And there is no reason to disturb any of the others. They're still there and untouched. So this is the nameplate. I'm not going to read this out. This is the English translation of the Latin that was on the nameplate and Latin inscription. But I know this is being recorded, so if you want to have a look at that after and later, you can see it on the recording. But we know, so we're happy that we're looking in the right place. So we have no desire to disturb anybody else's rest in these conditions, in these situations. This is an image of the coffin. You've already seen this on the video. The coffin is a traditional lead coffin. It's the law in the UK that if you're in a crypt or not buried below ground, that you should be in a sealed container, a sealed coffin. And in the past, they used lead to contain the coffin itself. This would have originally had a wooden coffin around the lead. So you'd have had a wooden coffin and then the lead container within it. And in this case, it's a double layer of lead. So you can actually see that. Your problem with lead is it's not, it deteriorates over time. And if you actually see, I don't know if you can see it in that image, it isn't helped by the fact that rather than when they sealed it by puncturing holes in the lead itself and pinching it together that way, rather than by using heat and sealing it. So that does not help the preservation of the coffin at all. Lead coffins tended to be used by the rich. They were expensive, but they were used to seal the body in so that you didn't get leakage, especially above ground, as the body deteriorated. You can see here that it's in poor condition. There's holes in the lid and there's also a hole in the base as well. So the condition of the lead is not good at all, which isn't great when we're thinking about preservation. If we're looking, and you can see the layout, this is how we set up, and you've seen this as well in the video. So this is where Sue got to sit, okay? I got the crypt, okay? pulled rank there. So what would happen is that I would recover and take the remains to Sue, and she would, in a much nicer conditions, look at the bones themselves and examine them in more detail. The thing is, if you're down and you're kneeling, see an image, you can see here, it's not glamorous, these scene suits, but it's not easy working when you're kneeling, and light wasn't optimal down there, so I was just doing the recovery very carefully. Okay. Obviously, we're wearing masks because of the dust, and it is a potential health hazard in those situations. So, once the lid came off the coffin, we can see that you've got the lead, the 2 layers of the lead, and you can see that there in the top left of the image. And then within that, you have another wooden coffin. Okay, so you would have had originally the 4 layers: wood, lead, and then wood again. And you can see here, this is the top end of the coffin, and this is the middle of the coffin, and you can see here that we have got remains. The bone's not great, it's damp, the damp's got in, and bones become very, very fragile in those situations. So it was very difficult to recover the bones in this. What we didn't have is any soft tissue. Sometimes with lead coffins you can get preservation of soft tissue even over long periods of time. We didn't have anything like this. These are skeletal remains only. What we have is there's no skull at the head end. So we open up, and this is the head end on the left, and there is no skull at the head end. We do have a body, and the body is laying in what we would call anatomical position. So it's laying, and it appears to have been laid out. So it's been laid there carefully, and it has not moved in the time frame since it was originally placed in that coffin. So what we need to do now, and what we did, was very carefully work our way through. So what did we find? We know what we haven't found. We haven't found a skull at this point. So again, looking at what we found. Haven't found a skull. What we did find near the head end is what's called the sacrum. So the sacrum sits and is part of that pelvis. And your pelvis, and is the bone, it's a triangular bone that sits at the back. So everything, that's what you're sitting on at the moment, okay, is your sacrum. And because the sacrum is part of the pelvis, it's a different shape for males than it is for females. And what we have here is a male sacrum. Probably an older male. You can see here on the bottom image that flat area of bone there should be oval, more rectangular. But you can see it's misshapen because there's some bone overgrowth on the edge of it. So that would indicate more likely to be an older individual, definitely male. The trouble is, those changes can happen if somebody's taking a lot of exercise or doing something very physical, but more likely to be linked to age. Can't say exactly how old they are, though. What we can say is that's the sacrum of an adult elderly male. Okay? So we can put that to one side. You can see the bone preservation is not great. There are pieces of the bone missing, and it's discoloured. What did we find next? A knee. So this is the end of the bone that comes down into the knee. It's adult, and that's all we can say about it. There's nothing else we can say about it at all. It was in at the top end of the coffin, and we can't say anything about except for which side of the body it comes from and where in the body it comes from. So, basically, having taken those bones and taken them up to Sue, I then worked all the way through the coffin. Okay. At this top end, you can see here that looks like it looks like leaf litter actually on this image, but what it actually was dried material. So obviously parts of a shroud. They gradually changed in time and had become soaked with the bodily fluids and then dried out. So that's what we had at the top end. And when I searched those, as you do, I found a large number of tooth crowns. Tooth crowns are part of the tooth development. We have two sets of teeth from when you're a child to when you're an adult, and as the teeth develop, they develop as crowns and sit within the jaws, upper and lower jaws. We know these are tooth crowns, and they're tooth crowns of a child of about 4 years of age. Okay? That was not what I expected to find at the head end of this coffin, I will say. I had a bit of a moment and recovered them, and we put them and had a look at them. There's 17 of them. They're the teeth, front teeth, and they are the back teeth as well. So once those had been recovered, we gradually worked our way through and recovered the rest of the body. So basically worked on my way down, and what I found was what I expected to find. Ribs, the sternum, so the bone that sits at the front here, the bones of the spine, a pelvis, and both hands lying. So they were lying and sitting on the thighs of the body, as you would if you were laying a body out. Down through the legs, and to the feet as well. And you actually saw me recovering a couple of those foot bones in the video. Once all the bones have been carefully removed, and you can see there you've got the wood exposed. I don't know how well that's come out. You can see the base of the coffin. But I could see that there was debris on either side of that base, and the base was loose. And the one thing I like to be is thorough. Okay, so I lifted that base of the coffin. It was loose. There's debris. We have to make sure we've had a proper look at one and recovered everything we can recover. I don't know how well this has come out, but I found underneath that wooden base more ribs and another manubrium. So we found ribs already. Okay, we've already found a manubrium, this bone here and the sternum that sits here, and underneath this wooden base we found more ribs and another sternum. So we've got a problem. We've got more than one individual. We've got an adult, we've got a child, and we've got a small adult here. When we actually look at this and separate them out and have a look at exactly what we recovered, I can say that we recovered the elderly male sacrum. That's one individual. Now, I can't link that to any other bones because it was lying at the head end of this coffin. And we find another sacrum further down where I would expect to find a sacrum from the body that's been laid out. We find an adult knee bone, so a bone from an adult knee. I can't link that to the sacrum either because you can only link bones by making sure they articulate and sit together. I've got the tooth crowns from a child as well, so that's 3 individuals sitting at the head end of the coffin. I've got the ribs and sternum from a small adult, that's 4 individuals. And I have the 5th individual, who's a headless skeleton, which is laid out in correct anatomical position. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, where did the other bones come from? Now, we had a coffin that had been breached. So the lead had come apart, and you could see on that original image that there were gaps that you could actually, in the lead and at the lid and at the base. And what we suspect has happened in the past is there's been tidying that's happened in the cemetery and in the burial area. And loose bones have been picked up by whoever's caretaking, and they have been put in the nearest coffin, and the nearest coffin that has had a hole in it. So we suspect that the sacrum, the 1, 2, 3, and 4, the sacrum, the knee, the tooth crowns from the child, and the ribs and sternum from a small adult have all come from that tidying process. It's known to happen, and we suspect that's what's happened. What we do have still is the question of who number 5 is. And I'm going to leave it there.
Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you as a national treasure. Thank you so much indeed. And one who was born in Inverness. To a mother who was a Fraser. I tell you, it's getting creepy. One of the great delights and pleasures of what I do is working as a part of a team, because you never work independently, you always work with others. And I first worked with Lucina in Kosovo in 1999, and we've worked almost closer than I think many married couples do, to the point that we can work in a team and have no conversation between us. We know what the other one needs at any one time. So although very, very kindly I get billed as the name on this, it is a team, and there is nobody else that I would rather work with in my team than Lucina Hackman. She is one of the best forensic anthropologists that we have in the UK, and Dundee is very, very lucky to have her. And frankly, I would never have identified those tooth germs. She did, and that's just clear indication of her capabilities. So, we've got a headless body. Now it's audience participation. Hands up if you think it's Simon Fraser, Lord Lovett. Okay, hands down. The heretics within the room. Hands up if you think it's someone else. Do you know? Some of you are right. And I would hope that, given that the infinite amount of information that you've seen that we can extract by separating individuals, that you'll have the confidence that actually we've taken this very seriously. Although this is a historical case, and some might argue, does it matter? As Sarah has quite really movingly said, every single burial matters, because it was somebody. Whether it's who we're looking for, it was somebody. And we've taken this process with great care. What I didn't do is the DNA. And I'm not a DNA expert, but we took a DNA sample. And Cerridwen Edwards, who's from the University of Huddersfield, is looking at that DNA for us. And I have her notes, just in case I get wrong. So what we've done is, because the bones were in such poor condition, the bone that we were able to have at least some hope of getting DNA from was that sternum, the breastbone that sits at the front. It's the one bit that was relatively intact. When we sent this down, what Cerridwen said to us was, it's in poor condition. It's very soft, it's very friable. If we can get any DNA out of this, we will be lucky, but we can at least try. There are two types of DNA that we have in our cells. We have nuclear DNA, which comes half from our mother, half from our father. And we have mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA, there's much more of it, and it tends to survive more readily. And your mitochondrial DNA came from your mother. Your father has no part in providing your mitochondrial DNA. And what she feels is that if any part is going to survive, it's likely to be mitochondrial. And that means we have to look down the matriarchal line associated with the DNA. It means that when we look at nuclear DNA, it gives us the opportunity to establish parenthood. So who is our mother, and actually who was our father, not just who our mother said our father might have been. If we have a Y chromosome, then the Y chromosome can only come through dad. And so part of our genetic material, if we're male, is solely from our father. But our mitochondrial DNA will only come from our mother. So what she did was she managed to clean the surface of the bone and to retrieve some bone samples. And there is a process which is called PCR. And what PCR is, it's like a great big photocopier. And it takes bits of DNA and it replicates it so that we end up with a large enough amount and volume for that DNA that allows us to then test it on a gel to establish whether this is going to be DNA that we can use. There is DNA present. There is DNA that is not bacterial DNA. It is inherent to an individual. It is mitochondrial DNA. And do you know what? She hasn't finished the testing yet. However, let me read what she says.
and do feel free to lynch her any time that you like. She says, as there appear to be no records of his sister or 2 of his 3 maternal aunts having daughters, the link would have been through his other maternal aunt, Marion MacLeod, who died in 1710. And this is the great thing about historical investigations. You think they've ended. No, they haven't. Now you've got to go and find all the descendants, if we want to use DNA. I don't think we need to use the DNA, because Lucina and I believe that we know who is in the coffin. Or maybe who's not in the coffin. This is the state of the material. And this is what we were looking at. It's very, very poor condition. So what we have to be able to do is identify every single fragment that we possibly can. You can imagine just how wet that is. And in the one on the left-hand side, that piece of white that you see running horizontally is part of a long bone. That gives you some idea of the condition. When we lay it out, the body looks something like this, and that gives you some idea of the fragmentation. But everything apart from a head is there, so that we have vertebrae, we have upper limbs, we have lower limbs, we have pelvis, we have hands, and we have feet. And that's why we're convinced that the individual who was in this coffin was laid out appropriately within that coffin. It's fairly difficult, I suspect, for you to see, but for us to be able to see, there are 2 thighs running down the length of that coffin. And that allows us to look for the area of the pelvis, because the pelvis is going to tell us whether this is male or female. And I'm going to keep going quite fast. We've got the sternum that we've sent down for the DNA to be tested, and from a sternum we can determine sex of the individual and the age of the individual. From the ribs, we can determine the age of the individual. From the vertebrae, we can determine the age. And from the sacrum, that's the second one, because remember we've already got one that certainly doesn't belong to the body in the coffin, then we can determine age and sex. And from the parts of the pelvis, then there is no doubt in our mind as to the sex of this individual. Lucina and I are of the opinion that we know both the sex of the individual in this coffin and the age of the individual in this coffin. Lord Lovat was male, and he was in the 70s, but certainly perhaps even up into his 80s. The individual who is buried within the coffin in Wardlaw Mausoleum is a woman of around the age of 30. So we are absolutely certain that it is not Lord Lovat, unless he was a woman aged 30, which we believe he was not. Now, after all of that, which is a horrible moment, and it's the point at which Lucina and I said, should we wear our Kevlar helmets? We're going to Inverness to tell them that it's not Lord Lovat that's in there. We are absolutely certain on that. What the question is, who's the woman in the coffin? And isn't that the best ending for every conspiracy theory that you possibly could have? What we then did, because we feel very strongly about these remains being human, having been somebody, is that they were re-encoffined. So that a coffin was brought to the Wardlaw Mausoleum and all of the remains were placed in a separate coffin. How fitting that, of course, it was a firm of Frasers. And our huge thanks, because my family have known Bill Fraser and Martin for years and years, how fitting for them that they came as Frasers to fit the body of whoever this person was back into that coffin. One thing is for certain, and one thing you can absolutely guarantee, and if you sit quietly, you'll hear him laughing. Because at the end of the day, he still got the best of absolutely every one of us in this room. 271 years later, the wily old fox is still in charge. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So, ladies and gentlemen, one myth may end, but another begins. And what I will be fascinated now over the next 10 to 15 minutes, because I'm quite anxious we conclude as close to 9 o'clock as possible, just to get your reaction to what Sue has been describing to you, what questions it raises for you, and I hope we can get as many comments as possible. You'll have to bear with us. There seems to be one roving mic only, so that means that my colleagues, the RSE staff, are going to be sprinting around you, I suspect, really quite quickly. So who would like to begin? And I would ask if you could identify yourself, if you're happy to do that, and indeed you identify which of my colleagues you would wish the question to go to. Who would like to start? At the back, first of all, and then down here.
Hi, I'm Muslim, and I just wanted to know, when you did find an elderly adult male pelvis in the coffin, would that suggest that perhaps the old folk was in another coffin in the mausoleum?
I think it's highly unlikely. I think the sacrum that we found, and of course we all got ridiculously excited the minute we found an elderly adult male sacrum. And as you saw from Dan at that point had decided that in fact we'd found Lord Lovat. But we've exhumed from lead coffins before, and where one is breached, you very, very frequently find tidy up time going on. And it's like sweeping dirt under the carpet. It's where do I put it so nobody sees it? And this will have come out of the cemetery somewhere. Every time you dig in a cemetery to put somebody down there, you disrupt the bones that are in there, and it's what do you do with them? And so I don't believe that the sacrum is what we're going to be looking for in Lord Lovat at all. I don't believe he is in the mausoleum, I'm afraid to say.
Gentleman down here.
I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. It's her fault. She was in the crypt.
It's on.
To Sue, again, sorry. Duncan Simpson, long lost relative, probably. My question would be, was the woman beheaded?
I don't actually know. We don't know. We didn't find any cervical vertebrae. They deteriorated. They are the smallest of all of the bones of the spine. So if you think about your spine, they only have your cervical vertebrae, your neck vertebrae only have to carry the weight of your head, whereas the vertebrae as they go down the body have to take your body weight. So they're larger as they go down. So we didn't find any that were in a good enough state to examine at all. They were just deteriorated. So I don't know is the answer to that question. There is a potential, of course, that the coffin had been breached and that people believed that it was Lord Lovat's coffin because it had his nameplate on it, and it may have been taken as a memento. That does happen. People take them home and put them on their mantelpiece or whatever they do with them. But so it may be that that's why there wasn't a skull in there, because, you know, unless there has been an issue like beheading, we should have expected to find one.
At the back.
Yes, Malcolm Milne. The question I had was, if the DNA sampling still goes ahead, would that be able to detect a geographical location for that corpse?
Not geographical. What it will do is it will allow us to say that if they're able to trace the maternal line of the DNA, then being able to say whether that individual was perhaps related within a known descendancy. What it won't allow us to do is to say this was somebody who was alive in the 1700s, this is somebody who had died in Inverness and had been down in London, or those sorts of things. It doesn't give us that information. It might give us some information through the ancient DNA records that they have of being able to place an individual within a family grouping. But whether that's a Fraser family grouping, of course, or not, and because it's only coming down through the maternal line, then it could be a wife of somebody, in which case you won't get the Fraser DNA. So in many ways, I think since 1980s, when Alec Jeffreys identified and DNA came into our world, we have this utter misconception that DNA solves everything. And until our DNA has got our name and our address sewn into the label, then it is sometimes of fairly limited information for us. But just to get the DNA itself would be a success. But I don't hold any hope that that DNA is going to get us to a name of the deceased woman, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Duncan Michael, Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It's wonderful to see what public funds can do for personal interests. The mausoleum sits next to my Michael lair in Wardlaw. We've been there, the stones take us back to 1700, and I'm still scraping. But picking up on Sarah, hundreds of others, the soldiers of the 11th Regiment, died badly too. It is odd that no recognition has been given to these glorious dead. They are equal to the World War I dead in numbers, in specific geography, and in awfulness. They need their monument.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, when you think, of course there'll be no names, because just as with the World War I soldiers, you have a soldier of the Great War. But having said that, that's what I was really trying to say when Dan was asked that question by Justin Webb. I was trying to say that this throws a light on everything that happened here, because when you're looking for evidence, and there's all sorts of evidence that the three of us have been looking for, it brings up the whole world. That's what you're trying to recreate. And yes, there should be some sort of, to the unknown dead of that civil conflict. Yeah.
Alexander from Edinburgh. I would just like to congratulate our speakers, because I think Lord Lambert would be very proud of you, because you bluffed a whole lot of them.
It was a problem, wasn't it?
Yeah. But I think the mystery and the myth goes on. And what I just wanted to ask was two questions. One is, what is the sort of perceived wisdom as to where his head is or went? And the second question is that, it would be very interesting to see the face of the man, because we have, modern imagery in 3D, and we can recreate the faces. There is someone actually in the audience here that was involved in the recreation of the face of, I can't remember, in Orkney, St Magnus. And it would be very interesting just to see what Lord Luke looked like.
Do you think Lord Luke could sit the tower as well? That's it.
So I just think that I agree that he would have thought that you were absolute stars in the way that you played it.
Yeah, it's been a long secret. I think that, and I think probably we would all think that he is in the tower, and probably that's where his head is as well. And whether you could ever, it would be, the red tape would be a nightmare, and the cost, because you would have to disinter the three Jacobite lords, Lovat, Balmerino and Kilmarnock, from behind that wall in St Peter at Vincula in the Tower of London. And then you would have to separate them all out. You could do that, it's an afternoon's work, isn't it? Get the hat off, get the mask. And then you would have to decide who is who, and then you'd have to go on your, if there was any DNA. It's probably better preserved, because it's probably been shut up in stone, behind stone. So you could, but I think we all now think that's where he is, don't we? Yeah, that's what we think. Sadly, devastating, but there we go.
Sue, do you want to? No.
What's the answer to that?
The lady just beside, no, the gentleman just beside you, and then we'll come to the front.
Oh, Eric Grant, from a Rose Market Cave project, which Sue has been very closely connected. She was able to do some wonderful work on Rose Market Man for us. The question I have is the lady in the coffin. I know we maybe not saying who she was. Is it possible to say that Was she a place person? Somebody to put in there to fill the coffin and say, this is Lord Lovat as a body in the coffin? Or is the plaque that is on the wrong coffin? Is it possible to say anything like that?
I don't know. It opens up so many more questions in many ways than we've answered. Are we in a situation where somebody has spent a lot of money on a very expensive coffin, because this would not have come cheap? And, you know, why would you leave an empty coffin if you need to use one? So you might have a situation where we have an empty coffin, we couldn't bring his body back, and so whether it's a family member or somebody else that has then gone into the coffin because it was an empty house and waiting to be used, we don't know. When the coffin was breached, did somebody open it up and go, he shouldn't have had a head, let's take that away? Was that to confuse other people, or was that as a trophy, it was suggested? Or did they actually go all the way down to London? Were they unable to take his body and go, well, we've got to put something in here? And we have an unfortunate lady who went in, because the coffin would have been sealed. It's unlikely that it would have been, the individual would have been viewed when the coffin came up to Inverness, because it would have been sealed. So we can never know whether it was some poor woman on the streets of London who ended up in Lovett's coffin, or whether it was somebody, whilst the coffin was here, it was an empty vessel and therefore it was filled. We don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And also you've got to put yourself back into that period. Although it was turbulent up here, to say the least, at that time, they didn't actually know whether some form of Jacobite uprising wasn't going to kick off again. So if they decided that they did want some kind of totem, something that people could gather around which discontent would gather, then for ideological reasons, you would get that coffin, put it together, put the right plate on, because again, we all agree that that's the right plate. The plate's right. Everything about that plate is right. And you would bring that north, because you don't know what's going on. It's a time of extreme uncertainty. And many people up here wanted it to happen again. Of course, it's very dangerous to do, because if that's your game, then you're committing high treason. So, again, that would explain the secrecy, why it's all open about Lovett's body having gone out of the tower initially, and then the minute he's buried, everything goes, as my children say, on the down low, because you're going to be in a lot of trouble, and there's already an inclination towards executing or transporting or dealing with people who are planning to rise again. Nathan's got one.
Oh, right, okay.
Oh, you got one from
the web?
Oh, yes, I have one from Glennis Hurd, who's been watching on the live stream, who asks, would it be possible to tell if the other remains, so presumably the ribs and the child's teeth, are all related to the women coffin? So even if you don't have a Fraser relative, but would it be possible to tell if they're all members of the same family?
Yes, it looks
Puzzlement.
like Treasurette, I think. No, I'm just trying to think how you the only way you'd be able to do it would be through DNA, and because they have been in, none of those bones were in good condition. They were in slightly different condition to the lady that had been laid out and had been laid out properly, but they were not in great condition. The teeth, no, that's just tooth enamel. There's no soft tissue there or anything that you can get DNA from. The ribs, the manubrium and sternum, and the you could maybe try to get DNA and mDNA, but that would then only show you a relationship if there's a female relationship through that. So you can only match people if they have a maternal line connecting them. So that would be the only way to do it, because I would be surprised if you'd be able to get any nuclear DNA from those. I'm not a DNA expert, I have to say that as well, but that would be the way you would do it.
Any? Yes, Eric, and then we'll come to two others further back.
Thank you. Edinburgh, Crackhill. Two questions. Was the lady, would we be able to date her time of death? in the century? Is it 18th century, is it 19th century, to know when she was put into the coffin? And the second question would be, you mentioned the sternum, that was found under the wooden base. How did it get there?
Okay, so I'm going to answer the first one, and Lucina's going to answer the second one. so that in terms of dating, the only thing that's available to you for dating is carbon-14 dating. And the bones are in a very, very friable state. You saw them, very poor condition. Plus, they've also been sealed in a lead can, and you get quite a lot of contamination of the lead into the bones as well, and that can make the dating really quite difficult and unreliable. So I don't happen to think that we'd get, because of the error involved in the dating, I don't think we would get close to being able to say for certain even which century she was in, quite frankly. And now for the theory of why there are bones under the base plate. I owe her a drink, she's just said.
There is only one potential explanation for it. The bones have to have gone in before the lady was laid out and placed into the coffin. The only thing that we could suggest, again, is a tidy-up type scenario, in that there's a potential for this coffin to be prepared. It was prepared and laid empty while they were perhaps trying to get the body up from England. Whether the body did, and it was a female that was brought up from London, or if it was a local woman that was placed in there, I suspect the coffin was open for a little while, and I suspect the tidy up probably happened, and
Hear it.
So yes, so that they have to have gone in as a intact chest plate though, because you've got the ribs and you've got the rib of the sternum, and they are attached in life by costal cartilages. So there's cartilage between your ribs and between the bone in the middle of your chest. But so I think again it's a tidy up, but it was a tidy up that occurred because the coffin was open and empty for a period of time. It's the only thing I can think of.
Two more contributions. There was one at the back there and one in the middle.
Hi, my name's Greg Perrine. My question is, I understand that we have no teeth from the woman because there was no head. I also understand that there is isotopic analysis you can do on teeth which can give you clues for a geographic location. Is there any technology that exists that might give us a geographic location for this woman other than teeth?
So first of all, the woman didn't have teeth. The teeth belonged to a child. So the only teeth that are present in the coffin are the teeth it's the crowns of teeth of about a 4-year-old. So yes, you could use isotopes on that will tell you something about the child. It doesn't link you necessarily to the woman, because we're not going to get DNA from the teeth, even if we do get DNA from the woman. So being able to link them is actually impossible. We can certainly look at other parts of the body, but our concern, and we've talked with a lot of our colleagues, our concern is the quality of the bone. This is not a nice dry bone. So when we were working on the Rosemarkie project, what we had was a beautiful set of skeletal remains. And there was a lot of material that you could test on. If you picked up what was the area of the femur, then it literally, as you picked it up, would fall apart. So there was very little structure holding the bone tissue together. And our chances of doing anything successful that for us at a forensic level would give us confidence is slim. If we were prepared to take the risk and say we're not too worried about the amount of variation, then it could be or it couldn't be. For us, that becomes a problem because we like very definitive science. Certainly when Cara Edwin is looking at the DNA, she'll look at other things, and we might have more information to feed back, but at the moment we just don't have that.
Right in the middle.
I don't think that answered it.
Put your hand up, sir, again.
Shall I just speak?
No, I think use the microphone, please, because some people will find that easier.
Thank you, Roland Spencer-Jones. Question for Sarah, really. I'm curious about the family tradition that the body was brought back. I wonder if you could just say a little more about the substance and the history of that family tradition.
No, it all based on the history and the fact, Roland, where are you? Yeah, of it having been out of the tower for 10 days. And if, for example, there's a body in the coffin that's in Kirkhill that isn't Lovat, well, of course, it would be just as easy to deliver a sealed coffin back to the tower with a body that wasn't Lovat. And what family tradition has always been is that it wasn't his body that went back and it was taken north. But there's no real evidence to substantiate that. I mean, it all rests on circumstantial evidence that it was out for long enough and they brought it back. The coffin's contemporary, the coffin plate is his. It's, as Sue... Oh, she's gone. No. Oh, as Sue has emphasised, it's a high-status coffin. It's a very expensive coffin, and you just wouldn't put anyone in it if you could possibly help it, which does raise the question of who's in there. But that's all it rests on, really.
Is it possible to follow the tradition over the last 271 years? Where has that tradition been located?
Oh, just oral tradition. I mean, once he is, it's tying the evidence that was in the tower and those letters between Williamson and Newcastle and the letter from Ingalls. Up with the evidence of the coffin that's actually in there, and it's deduction, but not right, sadly. But, sorry.
Where's the microphone gone? Oh, good. Down on this aisle here, the gentleman who's waving his hand. No contribution. I'm going to go into injury time, just a fraction. So if there's anybody in the right-hand side of the room as I look at it who wishes to ask a question, because you've so far not done so, please do, as the final question. Sir?
Ian Benny from Inverness Custom Tours. There's been a lot of talk about the bodies, but with the evidence that you've got with the coffin, is it possible to tell where the coffin was made, where the wood came from, which might give you an idea if it was made down in England and then brought up with the body, or if it was made in Scotland? Is there any way of tracing that?
That's a really good question. I'm way out with my area of expertise. I'm sorry, She's good. I really don't know the answer to that.
Is there any more investigations going to happen after this, or is this the conclusion that we have?
There's absolutely no reason why somebody that knows couldn't look into that. I mean, it is something that I don't know anything about, we don't know anything about, but there may be somebody out there that could answer that, and it would be a legitimate line of query to go down, absolutely.
Well, particularly with the wood. With wood, maybe, because you could. There's quite a lot of wood, isn't there, still, and that can be measured, and that could be tested.
Any contributions from the far side? Elsewhere?
The other side. Lovett's going to talk to us himself. Really far side.
Very much for your attendance. I've got, I think, 4 aspects that I wish to conclude by. Thinking that this has been a most fascinating evening. I'd like to begin with thanks to Kate Kennedy of the RSE and her colleagues who have worked wonderfully